Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We're studying together in Maimonides, Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the chosen house, and at the moment we're studying about the measurements of the Holy Temple. A lot of details we're going to be discussing, the exact plans for the building of the temple. Of course, the bottom line of all of this is that there really was a temple. The temple is intrinsic part of the destiny of the Jewish people and the purpose that the Jewish people play in this world for the sake of all humanity. The building of the Holy Temple is part of God's plan. And really the bottom line of everything that we do and that we're discussing and that we're learning and everything that we always should be doing is the fact that there is a God in the world. No matter what we do, we always come back to that equation. Everything is about knowing who Hashem is and living for Him and making Him part of our lives. The reason that I bring all of this up now in such a reflective way is because as we are making this program now, we are still in the midst of the days that are leading up to the peace conference in Annapolis, where it is already established that pressure will be brought against Israel by the United States and other parties to further cede her homeland to her enemies. And much of this pressure is really inexplicable when we realize that there seems to be some sort of complicit agreement and cooperation that doesn't make any sense to us here, those of us who are faithful to the Torah, complicit agreement from the side of the leadership of Israel. And now we understand also that even the city of Jerusalem and everything holy to the Jewish people, even indeed the Temple Mount itself, seems to be open for negotiation. And this is quite, as I say, inexplicable when we understand how important this is to the Jewish people, and who will be speaking there for the name of the Torah, for the sake of the Holy One, blessed be Himself, in His name, in the name of the true spirit of the people of Israel, I don't know. So therefore we have to take every opportunity that we have beforehand to reiterate the fact that the Temple Mount is the center of creation, the one place on earth that Hashem, the God of Israel, chose to rest His presence, that Hashem is not finished with that place, but that indeed all of the prophets tell us of how the temple will be rebuilt, and that will again become the most important place on earth. And Hashem says, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. My house, according to my rules, according to the rules of the Holy Torah, shall be called a house of prayer for all people." Not as it is now, that it is indeed a house of prayer only for Islam, that Islam has no respect whatsoever for any other religion, and when they're not busy actually physically destroying the remnants of the Holy Temple, as we saw this past summer, then they are busy denying and rewriting history and attempting to distance the Jewish people from any connection to this place. And all of this is so totally absurd and so totally intangible and bizarre, really, when you think about this equation, that it behooves us on every opportunity that we have to speak against it, to speak clearly and loudly and proudly about the fact that the Temple Mount is the only place in the world that is holy to the Jewish people. And not to shirk from our responsibility of stating clearly and unequivocally that this place cannot possibly be under negotiation or open for anyone's suggestions, because we live according to Hashem's rules, and this is not personal real estate or holdings that belongs to any individual or group of people or government. And I think that Hashem makes that very, very clear in the Holy Torah. So let us focus and really strengthen ourselves as we study the laws of the temple in such detail, realizing that we are representatives and ambassadors of Hashem Himself in the world, being knowledgeable and being straightforward about the dimensions of the temple. So we are up against forces that come along and say, you have no right to be here whatsoever, there is no temple, there was no temple in the past, there won't be one in the future, and you Jewish people have no say whatsoever and no connection to this place. So we come back to them and we tell them there indeed was a temple, and there indeed will be a temple again, and nothing in the world can change that. And by sanctifying Hashem's name, by taking such a clear and straightforward path, we indeed are aiding in bringing closer the time of the temple. Perhaps everything is waiting, as far as Hashem is concerned, for us to show that it's really something that we're willing to fight for. And one of the best ways that we can join in the fight is by being as prepared as possible to rebuild the temple, by studying, by participating, by supporting the efforts to rebuild the temple, and certainly by supporting the efforts to return the temple back to the forefront of consciousness of the Jewish people and the whole world. This is not just about the temple itself, it's about everything that the temple represents, the way of life of being connected to Hashem. It's temple consciousness, and therefore it is a spiritual revolution. And by our studying these laws, we are part of that revolution, because we are stating clearly that we are preparing now for the building of the temple. And I think every once in a while it's important for us to remember that. We are not just studying details here, we're studying a plan of action. There's nothing in the whole Torah as detailed as the details pertaining to the Holy Temple. It's so amazing. There are hundreds of commandments in the Torah. There are innumerable sources. There is so much information in the Torah. It's a lifetime of study, and even then we can't possibly even but scratch the surface. But do you realize that there's no area of scholarship of any particular subject in the whole Torah as detailed as what we're studying now? And the reason for that is because we need to rebuild it. So we are in the midst of Maimonides' Laws of the Chosen House, the 4th chapter. And now we have several halachot that relate to other dimensions of the temple. Until now, in our last lesson actually in Beit HaBechira, we were studying about the Holy Temple from bottom to top, about the 100 Amma. And remember that Maimonides tells us he has a particular approach of understanding the actual structure of the sanctuary, where he derives that it is a perfect cube. We're going to see it's not exactly a perfect cube, but it's basically a perfect cube of 100 amot in length, 100 amot in width, and at a height of 100 amot. And in Halacha Gimel, the last thing that we learned together in Beit HaBechira, we analyze that 100 amot in height. So now, in Halacha Dalid, Maimonides tells us, Min ha'ma'arav la-mizrach mea amma, v'zeu cheshbonan. Obviously, since we're talking about a cube, it's 100 amot in every direction. Now he tells us that from the west to the east it is 100 amot, and now he is going to delineate exactly the cheshbon, the reckoning of that 100 amot. We are going to be measuring the length of the sanctuary, beginning with the western wall, that is to say, the western wall, the back of the Holy of Holies. And we're going to be measuring towards the front of the structure from west to east. So, Maimonides tells us, Arba'a ktalim ze lifnim mizeh, ubeinehen shlosha mekomot pnuyin. Then it's important for us to focus on the diagrams that we are providing here in this broadcast regarding the exact description. Focus on the description of how Maimonides is basically interpreting the Mishnah. The Rambam himself has a very unique approach. We've already stated this a number of times, to understanding how the walls in the temple are situated. And basically, this is based on the Mishnayot in Masechet Midot, the tractate of attributes, which describes the attributes of the temple. And it's the 4th chapter of those Mishnayot. But Maimonides has a totally different approach to how we understand these walls. He is looking at it as follows. He tells us that there are a set of walls that we can measure out now, and now we're measuring in this particular halacha from west to east, and these walls basically have a space in between them, so that every time one of these walls is mentioned, he's actually measuring 2 walls and the space between them, with 2 exceptions that we're going to see. In other words, Maimonides here is explaining the concept of the wall itself as referring to a wall of a thickness of 1 amma, and then a space in between, and then another wall. You have to understand that there's a concept which is very much very much the subject of machloket, of some controversy exactly between the commentators of exactly what it means. There's a concept called the ta'im. Taf aleph, literally means a space or a cell or a box. And there is an idea that all around the outside of the sanctuary there are ta'im. There are these cells, these empty spaces around the building. Ta'im, cells. And there's a question exactly about what the purpose of these cells was and exactly where they are located. The Rambam's opinion, which is actually quite unique, is that these ta'im, these cells, were actually formed by the spaces in between the walls themselves, and therefore they ran all the way through the walls, these spaces. So he tells us again as follows: Min ha'ma'arav le'mizrach mea amma v'zeu cheshbonan. From west to east, we measure out a measurement of 100 amma. Arba'a ktalim ze lifnim mizeh. There are 4 walls sequentially from west to east. We have one, then we have another one, and we're moving towards the front of the sanctuary. And in between these 4 walls, there are 3 empty spaces. How does that work? Bein hakotel hamaravi ubein hakotel shelifnim mimenu 5 amot. First of all, we have the extreme western wall, which is that we use the expression hakotel hamaravi, and that certainly is not by any means the Kotel Hamaravi of today, the western wall that people worship at. He's referring to the western wall of the sanctuary itself, the back of the sanctuary. So from that wall until the next wall in progression, we have a space of 5 amot. So look at the diagram and see from the back wall, the western wall, until the next wall in progression, we have 5 amot. But again, according to the Rambam, we have to see exactly how that measurement works. Ubein kotel sheni ushlishi 6 amot. And then we have another wall between this and the next with a space of 6 amot. Ubein kotel shlishi urevi'i 6 amot. And then we have a 4th wall. So we've gone from the Kotel Hamaravi, the back western wall of the sanctuary, to the next wall, and then that's the second wall. We're calling that Kotel Sheni, the second wall. And there is 6 amot between the second and the third wall. Ubein Kotel Shlishi Urevi'i 6 amot. And then we have another wall, the 4th wall. So this is also like a set. We have another space of 6 amot between the third and the 4th wall. So far we have this description. Ve'elo hamidot hen shel avi hakotel im hamakom hapanui shebein shnei ktalim. And the Rambam's interpretation of the words of the Mishnah in Midot is that the walls that are described are inclusive of the walls themselves, including the space, the empty space in between 2 walls. So this is his particular interpretation, which is unique in that we are actually measuring the walls and the halal, the empty space, in between each of them. In other words, basically what we're saying here is that according to Maimonides, every wall, and this is extremely important to understand, every wall that's mentioned in the structure of the house, according to the Mishnah, is actually a set of 2 walls, including the space in between them. And the space of each wall itself, the width of each of the 2 walls is 1 amah, and the ovi, the thickness that is described in the Mishnah, the inference according to Maimonides is the measurement of the wall, the space in between the wall, and then the next wall. So if we're saying that, for example, in between the second and the third wall, we have 6 amot, that means that each of the second and third walls themselves is 1 amah of thickness, and the remainder is the space in between. It's interesting to note, first of all, this is the exception to this idea that all of the walls mentioned in the Mishnah are actually a set of 2 walls, a zug, a pair of 2 walls, and the space in between. The exception would be the actual external wall of the sanctuary itself, which is only 1 wall, and, as we're going to see, the eastern wall of the sanctuary itself as well, the wall in which we find what's called the Great Gate into the Heichal itself. But this, otherwise, this is his interpretation. So, basically, and by the way, I also have to mention that the idea of that I just mentioned of the thickness of each of the two walls themselves being 1 amah is not explicitly mentioned here in the Rambam, if you noticed. But it is inferred in some of what the Rambam writes in his commentary to that Mishnah in in the tractate Midot. So what we're saying here, again, a bit revolutionary from other interpretations of the Mishnah. The Rambam has built an entire understanding, which is his understanding of the structure of the sanctuary, that the walls mentioned in Masechet Midot that describe this progression from, and now we're talking about from west to east, we're also going to be talking about from north to south. These are actually not single walls, but a set of two walls with a space in between. That's, as we're going to see, how the Rambam understands the concept of the ta'im, the cells in the walls, and also how he understands these measurements. So according to our understanding of the Mishnah, again, in Maimonides' eyes, we have three spaces, and these spaces, three empty spaces in between the walls. And these empty spaces, the language with which Maimonides describes them is mikomot pnuin, which means literally empty spaces, free spaces. So these three spaces are accompanied by four walls themselves. Okay, again, the western wall here that is mentioned, meaning the outside wall on the western side of the sanctuary itself. So when our Mishnah in Tractate Midot, and here we haven't done this so much until now, we haven't cross-referenced so much to the Mishnah, but the fact is it's impossible really to appreciate what the Rambam is saying on his own. It's very important to contrast it to the Mishnah, so that's why we have to look at the Mishnah itself. In our Mishnah, the expression is kotel hata chamesh, that the wall of the cell is 5 amot. So this is the entire distinction that I keep making, that according to this unique opinion of the Rambam, this is not the measurement of the wall itself, the thickness of the wall, but rather the western wall on the outside of the sanctuary and the space in between it and the wall next to it, all of that. In other words, again, look at the diagram and look at the Kotel Hamaravi, the back wall, the western wall of the sanctuary, the space in between it, and then what we're referring to as the second wall, that entire grouping, inclusive, it is a measurement of 5 amah. So here is our idea now of the progressive walls. And again, empty spaces, we have the western side, and in between it and the next wall, we have a space of 5 amot. Then we have between the second and the third wall, 6 amot, again inclusive of the walls themselves and the empty space. Between the third and fourth wall, 6 amot. And again, Maimonides is explaining b'tzura mefureshet in explicit terms. Ve'elu hamidot hein shel avi hakotel ema makom hapanoi shebein shnei ktalim. These midot, these attributes, refer to the thickness of the walls together with the space in between. Now, Maimonides tells us ve'orech kodesh hakodashim 20 amah, and then we measure the length from, we're going again from west to east, of the Holy of Holies itself, and that is 20 amot. That is, of course, the inner dimension of the Holy of Holies, as is explained there in the Mishnah. And again, it's interesting to note that the Holy of Holies in the era, in the epoch of the tabernacle, was exactly 10 amot in length. So you see that in the era of the temple, this was doubled exactly to 20 amot. Now, so we're going again, we've reached from the western wall of the sanctuary, we've reached now to the Holy of Holies, and then we come to the Holy of Holies, which we have 20 amot from west to east. Ve'avi hakotel hamizrachi, ubein shtei haparachot hamabdilot beino, ubein hakodesh amah. And then we come to the eastern extremity of the Holy of Holies, and then of course we have the amatraxin, which we learnt all about. We have the two curtains which divide between the Holy of Holies and the holy area, and that is again the width of 1 amah. Ve'orach HaKodesh 40 amah. And then we have the sanctuary itself. Again, we're going from west to east. So first we learned about the back area behind the Holy of Holies, and then the Holy of Holies. We're progressing now from west to east, and now the length of the holy, the Kodesh of the Heichal, the sanctuary itself, where stands, of course, the 3 vessels, the menorah, incense altar, and the table of the showbread, that is 40 amot. Va'avi hakotel hamizrachi shabo hashar 6 amot. And then the width of the eastern wall of the sanctuary, in which is the gates of the sanctuary itself, that is a width of 6 amot. And of course, as we mentioned, this wall is not a double wall. This is the one single wall. Ve'ulam 11 amah. And then we have the width of the outer hall, which is 11 amah. Va'avi kotel ha'ulam. And the thickness of the wall of the outer hall, 5 amot, is 5 amot. Nimtza hakol 100 amah. And therefore, the Rambam tells us, we find that the entire reckoning of the length, of the sanctuary itself from west to east, we come to a reckoning of 100 amot. And it's a bit confusing, especially in understanding the shita, the opinion of Maimonides, which is again very, very unique. And as we continue, we're going to study a bit more about the nature of these walls and the spaces in between. And also we're going to be comparing the interpretation of Maimonides to some other ways of understanding the exact structure of the Heichal. So continuing into the next halacha, halacha Hey, we're going to go from north to south. And Maimonides tells us in halacha Hey, min hatzafon l'darom 100 amah. Obviously, if we're understanding that the structure is a perfect cube, more or less, and I must say that now because we're going to see that there has to be a way of interpreting it slightly different. Even within Maimonides' words himself, it can't be an exactly perfect cube, and we're going to see why. But basically speaking, also from the north to the south, we're going to have a width of 100 amah. Avi kota ha'olam 5 amot. The outer wall around the sides of the hall is 5 amot. Umikotel ulam ad kotel hakodesh 10 amot. And then we have a space from the wall of the ulam, of the hall, until the wall of the sanctuary of 10 amot. Again, inclusive of the space in between. V'katlei hakodesh 6 ktalim. And now Maimonides tells us, and this is actually quite interesting and makes sense according to what we learn as far as the dimensions from west to east. Now he tells us that the width of the walls of the actual sanctuary, the walls of the Kodesh, are actually, first of all, he tells us that there are 6 walls altogether, each one within the next. Ubeinehen 5 mekomot pnuyin. It tells us there are 6 walls in the width of the holy, of the sanctuary, with 5 spaces in between. Bein kotel chitzon ubein hasheni 5 amot. Between the outer wall and the next, there is 5 amot. Ubein sheni ushlishi 3 amot. And between the second and third, there are 3 amot. V'chamesh bein shlishi u'revi'i. And then again 5 amot inclusive between the third and fourth. Ubein revi'i v'chamishi 6. And then between the fourth and the fifth, 6 amot. Ubein chamishi v'kotel hapnimi 6. And between the fifth wall and the inner wall of the sanctuary, 6 amot. Nimtza hakol 40 amah mitzad ze ve40 amah mitzad ze shekenegdo. Therefore, when we look at our diagram, we see that on either side of the sanctuary, on either the northern or the southern side, we have a calculation of 40 amot on each side. V'rochav habayit mibifnim 20. And the actual width of the sanctuary itself, from within its walls, 20 amot. Harei 100 amah. And therefore, we have a calculation, once again, in width of 100 amah. Now, it's very important for us to attempt to rectify a number of minor issues regarding some classic descriptions of the temple itself to what Maimonides is writing. Because Maimonides has such an unusual interpretation of how to understand the structure of the walls, it puts us in a bit of a dilemma regarding a statement that was made by our sages that describes the temple as the sanctuary as having kind of like a T shape. And in many of the classic illustrations, and like some of the ones that you see here, that we have portrayed, for example, the temple, we see that the outer hall of the sanctuary is wider than the rest of the building. So if Maimonides is teaching us that the building is actually a perfect cube, how do we rectify this understanding that actually there's a comparison? Our sages tell us that the sanctuary resembles a lion crouching. So that it's wider in the front, and then it tapers off, becomes more narrow. And this is a very, very important and famous teaching. So we have to understand Maimonides' interpretation of the Mishnah and of some of these ideas. And in our next lesson, we're going to be analyzing this even more. And as you can see, everything about the plans for the temple has been recorded with very, very great detail, not just for posterity and not just for the sake of learning, but because we must be very, very fluent and very involved with the actual dimensions of the temple. When the time comes for it to be rebuilt, we cannot have a situation where we haven't been dealing with this subject and where we think that it's going to come down from heaven, or we think that maybe it never existed altogether because people are trying to convince us of that, or we have some sort of disconnect or alienation from this. This is very, very real. That's why the Torah bothers to make sure that we have these details with such rich portrayal, because the time will come when it will be up to us to rebuild the temple, to reintroduce into the world the light of the divine presence, the light to Israel and the light to the nations.
Light to the Nations is produced by the Temple Institute, Jerusalem, Israel. Dedications are available for upcoming Light to the Nations teachings. To make a dedication, please visit templeinstitute.org, the multimedia section, Light to the Nations, or email us at temple@temple.org.il. Your dedications help to make these productions possible.